Story number 1. The summer of 2001 seemed to stretch languid and heavy over the sleepy suburbs of Huntsville, Alabama, a town dusted with the secrets of space explorations and the whispers of the brilliant minds that fueled them. Among those minds was my grandmother, Edith. At 90, she was a former NASA communications expert, and her stories, typically brimming with pride over lunar missions, had taken a disturbing turn. I was monitoring the comms. She would begin, her voice a rasping whisper that made the hairs on my arms stand on end, when I heard it. A child's voice, lost in the static, counting backward from 10. Haunted by her recollections, I, a fledgling journalist, decided to dig into this macabre mystery from her past. That's how I found myself driving down the shadow-dappled lanes of Huntsville, where the trees seemed to lean in too close, as if they too wanted to hear the tale. I convened a small team of friends: Alex, a tech-savvy kid with more gadgets than sense; Rachel, a stoic psychology graduate student interested in the effects of isolation on the mind; and Chris, an amateur historian and conspiracy theorist who believed every story hid a kernel of truth. As we gathered in my cramped apartment, poring over the old NASA communications logs my grandmother had saved, a picture began to emerge. The isolated frequency activated only when the space station passed what astronauts had nicknamed the Devil's Pocket in Earth's orbit. The logs were a graveyard of unexplained phenomena: instruments failing, astronauts reporting shadows moving just out of sight, and, chillingly, the occasional exorcism performed in space as a desperate measure against an unseen foe. "It happened to me," Rachel murmured, fingers tracing the log entries, "to feel the cold that these astronauts must have felt. Alone, surrounded by the void." We decided to track down the precise location on Earth that corresponded with the Devil's Pocket. The journey led us to an old, abandoned church in the outskirts of Huntsville, a remnant of a community that vanished from the map sometime in the 1960s. I was walking through the aisles, Chris confessed one night as we examined the church, when I heard a child's laughter. Nobody else was inside. The deeper we dug, the more we unearthed. The church had been the heart of a cult that worshipped celestial entities, conducting rituals to open gateways to the stars. Their final ceremony coincided with a NASA mission in 1961, which, as per my grandmother's stories, had ended in catastrophe. "It happened to me," Alex said shakily, after setting up audio equipment that captured the same eerie countdown my grandmother described, to believe that some frequency should never be found. The conclusion was inevitable yet unfathomable. The cult had succeeded in some perverse way. They had opened a door, and something had come through, something that remained in orbit, waiting, whispering down to anyone who would listen. I was compiling our findings when tragedy struck. Alex was found dead, his equipment replaying the child's countdown endlessly. Rachel disappeared, only to be found days later, mute and unresponsive. Chris became obsessed with devil worship, claiming he was hearing voices that promised the universe's secrets in exchange for unspeakable acts. I am the last of our group, sitting in the dim light of my computer, documenting this story. The church is gone, razed to the ground one night in a fire that left no trace, and the space station was decommissioned, its final crew never speaking of their experiences in the Devil's Pocket. The static is all that remains, a hiss that seems to laugh at our attempts to understand. It happened to me, to realize that some frequencies are a siren's call to madness, and some truths are too heavy for the human mind to bear. And sometimes, when the night is silent, and the stars are obscured by clouds, I can hear it, a child's voice, counting down from 10. But I dare not listen to what comes after, for fear that it might finally reach one. Story number 2. In the frost-kissed autumn of 2002, when the nights were long and the shadows clung to the corners of Huntsville's quiet streets, my grandmother, a retired NASA engineer named Mabel, revealed a story to me that stretched the fabric of reality until it frayed. Her eyes, clouded with age, seemed to look through me, to a past stained with cosmic horror. "I was working in the control room," she recounted, "when we realized that we had one astronaut too many aboard the ship. This chilling admission became the catalyst for an investigation driven by morbid curiosity and the reckless bravery of youth. My team consisted of Leah, a grad student in folklore with an appetite for the macabre; Jonah, a soft-spoken physics major who could rationalize even the strangest phenomena; and Derek, a local journalist whose skepticism was as sharp as his pen. "I was driving us to the old NASA archives," Derek recounted, the skepticism having long since drained from his voice, "when I felt it. The weight of a story that didn't want to be told. Inside those archives, we found the mission logs of the Gemini 19, a spacecraft that had encountered something inexplicable in the void. The mission had been scrubbed from public record, but the haunting transcripts remained, speaking of a spacewalk where Commander Jack Mason had stepped out into the abyss and returned to find himself already on board. "It happened to me," Leah whispered, poring over the archaic recordings, to feel my skin crawl as both voices claimed to be the real Mason, each detail as precise as the other. We sought the surviving crew, only to discover a trail of tragedy. One had committed suicide, another had become a recluse, and the third had disappeared entirely. Their families spoke of changed men, of whispers in the dark and shadows that moved on their own. The only clue led us to an abandoned lot in the suburbs, where the crew had once lived in shared accommodation during their training. I was walking through the rooms, Jonah told us, his voice tinged with fear, when the air turned cold, and I knew we weren't alone. We delved into research on doppelgangers, on folklore and myth, on tales of otherworldly entities that mirrored human forms. And as we did, we became haunted by our reflections, never sure if we were looking at ourselves or something else. Our own investigation took a sinister turn when Leah disappeared from her home, leaving behind a journal filled with frantic scribbles about the other. Derek was next, found staring into his own reflection in a lake, unwilling to speak a word ever since. It happened to me, I confide to you now, to witness the unraveling of reality itself. In my dreams, I see the Gemini 19 drifting through the stars, and in every window, my own face stares back. And as I sit here, recounting this tale, the room grows cold, and in the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of something, someone standing just out of sight. I am compelled to look, to face the creature that wears my grandmother's sweet smile, but I dare not meet its gaze. I know, deep down, that the cosmic doppelganger is not just a story. It is a warning, a cosmic echo of something unexplainable that lingers in the silence of space. And now, it waits for me. So, I urge you, listen to this tale with a guarded heart, for it happened to me to discover that some truths are better left adrift in the cold expanse of the universe, where they can never reflect our darkest fears back upon us. Story number 3. I remember the biting chill of that November in 2003, when the skies over our small, forgotten suburb of Bakerstown, Pennsylvania, seemed heavy with secrets. My grandmother, with her clear, piercing eyes, would often recount the tales from her youth with a shiver, as if the cold of space itself had nestled into her bones. I was just an intern, she would whisper, the light from the fireplace casting unsettling shadows on her face, when I first heard the lost cosmonaut's signal. A voice, crying out from the void, long dead but not silent. That year, armed with inherited curiosity and an old tape of unexplained space transmissions, I roped in my friends, Damien, a budding audio engineer who could decipher signals hidden to most ears, Kara, whose degree in Russian had her translating the ghostly distress calls, and Noah, a paranormal investigator with more enthusiasm than experience. I was walking through my grandmother's attic. I told them one night, as we sat around the old tape player, when I found it. The recording. It's been waiting for us. The voice on the tape was a spectral echo, a cosmonaut calling for help in a ship that never returned to Earth. The mission had been scrubbed from history, but the signal, impossibly, was bleeding through time and space, reaching us. As we investigated, the world around us seemed to warp. Time felt like a loop, and the cosmonaut's voice became a constant presence. Damien found patterns in the static, or repetition that hinted at coordinates. It happened to me, he confessed, eyes wide, to find a map in the madness. The coordinates led to a secluded spot in the woods of Bakerstown, where a forgotten Soviet satellite had crashed decades prior. Kara, translating the last of the distress calls, realized the cosmonaut had spoken of something else on board, something that had come from the stars. I was driving us to the site, Kara murmured, her voice trembling, when the sky seemed to darken, as if it remembered the terror it once witnessed. The closer we got to the truth, the more reality seemed to slip away. We found the crash site, an eerie clearing where the trees refused to grow. Noah set up his equipment, eager to capture any spectral phenomenon. It happened to me, Noah said with a haunted look in his eyes, to see the impossible. Shadows that moved against the light, whispers in a language not meant for human ears. One by one, we fell victim to the cosmonaut's curse. Damien vanished, leaving behind only a tape of static. Kara became lost in her translations, her mind consumed by alien prophecies. Noah was found, lifeless, an expression of sheer terror frozen on his face. Now I sit here alone, the last witness to the horrors we uncovered. The tape still plays in my dreams, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the cosmonaut's plea, as fresh as if it were broadcasted just moments ago. It happened to me, I recount with trembling hands, to gaze into the abyss and find it full of stars and screams. So take heed of this story, a creepypasta born from the depths of space and the human psyche. Some frequencies should never be tuned into, for they carry the weight of dead souls and the darkness of the cosmos that swallowed them whole. Beware the lost signals, the ghostly echoes of the past, for they can haunt you long after the tape has stopped playing. Story number 4. In 2004, in the gray, sprawling suburbs of Clear Lake City, Texas, home to many of NASA's elite, my grandmother's tales filled my nights with a terror that clung to my thoughts like shadows at dusk. She spoke of a time shrouded in secrecy when humanity reached for the moon not for glory but out of an insatiable curiosity for something otherworldly. I was part of the communications team, she confided in a hushed tone that hinted at fear long buried, when Apollo XX returned. They were meant to collect moondust. What they brought back was different. It was October when I, alongside my friends, delved into her past. There was Max, a historian with a penchant for conspiracy theories, Sophie, a biochemist intrigued by the possibility of extraterrestrial life, and Ethan, a documentary filmmaker driven by the allure of the unknown. I was driving past the old Apollo launch sites, Max recounted, his usual skepticism lost to an edge of obsession, when it hit me. This wasn't just a legend. It was real. We found the declassified files, testimony of astronauts speaking in cryptic terms about the dust they had encountered, of silvery particles that moved against the vacuum of space as if alive. The astronauts, once esteemed members of society, had become recluses or simply vanished without a trace. It happened to me, Sophie whispered, her voice unsteady as she recounted analyzing a sample I had stolen from my grandmother's locked cabinet, to see the dust react, to watch it dance like it was more than just inanimate particles. As our investigation deepened, so too did the strangeness that enveloped our lives. We would wake up with no memory of hours past, finding cryptic messages written in our own hand that spoke of the moondust entity. The turning point came when Ethan went missing. His camera was found in a field, the footage showing only the night sky and a voice, his own, speaking an invocation in a language we couldn't identify. I was walking through Ethan's last known whereabouts, Max told us, his face pale and drawn, when the ground beneath me felt alive, as if something was stirring just beneath the surface. We traced the disappearances to a storage facility where NASA kept artifacts from past missions. Inside, we found a containment unit designed for lunar samples, breached from within, its contents gone except for a layer of that same silvery dust. It happened to me, Sophie confessed when we regrouped, to feel something inside me shift when I touched the dust. It's like it knew me, like it wanted something from me. I sit here now, the sole chronicler of our descent into this lunar madness. Max disappeared after claiming he had been visited by an astronaut who should have been dead for years. Sophie was found catatonic, her eyes filled with moonlit terror, mouthing words of a celestial prophecy. It happened to me, I tell you with a heavy heart, to lose everything to the moondust entity. So heed this tale, a creepypasta born from the darkest corners of human ambition and cosmic horror. The moon is not a barren rock orbiting our world, it is a silent witness, keeping secrets that should never be unearthed, of entities that whisper to us in our dreams of the vast, cold reaches of space. And if you ever find yourself gazing at the moon, feeling its silent call, remember our story and look away. Some lights are not meant to guide you home, they are beacons for things ancient and sentient, waiting for their chance to cross the void. Story number 5. In the summer of 2005, an oppressive heatwave swept through the suburbs of Huntsville, Alabama, the kind that seemed to press secrets out into the open. Among those secrets were stories my grandmother told me, her voice always dropping to a whisper, about the time at NASA when the skies above us weren't so empty. I was tracking satellites, she would begin, her fingers trembling as if the memory carried its own chill, when the anomaly appeared. It asked questions no man-made object should know to ask. At the time, I was just out of college, a fresh-faced graduate with a mind for astrophysics and a heart yearning for mystery. My friends, intrigued by the tales I relayed, decided to probe deeper. Rachel, an adept hacker with a knack for uncovering hidden data, Tyler, a linguist who could decipher patterns in any language, and Elise, a journalist with a nose for sniffing out the truth. It happened to me, Rachel confessed one evening as we pored over her laptop to find the last transmission. The questions it asked, they were about us. The unknown object had orbited Earth, silent and observing, before it began to broadcast. The signals, once deciphered, were a series of chilling questions about human life, emotions, culture, and our understanding of death. I was walking home, Tyler said, his voice strained, when I realized the questions weren't random. It was learning, evolving its understanding with every pass it made. Our search led us to a decommissioned NASA facility on the outskirts of Huntsville, where rumors spoke of a hidden archive containing answers. At night, we broke in, the air stale with the weight of long-forgotten secrets. It happened to me, Elise murmured, her hand clutching mine in the pitch-black corridor, to hear the whispers. They were repeating the questions, over and over, as if an invisible presence was there with us. We found the archive, a dusty room filled with reel-to-reel tapes and old computer drives. The last of the transmissions was there, a haunting message that ended with a question that made my blood run cold. Have you understood your mortality? The next days were a blur of paranoia. We saw figures in the shadows, and the questions from the signal began to appear on our phones, our screens, written in condensation on our windows. I was driving to meet you guys, Rachel said, her eyes wild with fear, when my GPS glitched. It took me to a cemetery and just stopped. One by one, my friends succumbed to the anomaly's curse. Tyler was found in his room, surrounded by scribbled translations, dead from no discernible cause. Rachel disappeared, her last message to me a string of garbled text and a location pin that led to nowhere. And Elise, poor Elise, was found in a trance, endlessly typing out the anomaly's last known question on an old typewriter in the abandoned NASA archive. It happened to me, I recount with a shiver, to be the last witness to the orbiting anomaly's thirst for knowledge. The signal might have stopped, but its effects lingered, leaving a trail of broken minds and unexplained deaths. And the most disturbing thought of all? The object, whatever it was, had found its answers and moved on, leaving us to dwell on the questions it had provoked about our very existence. So take this story, a creepypasta born of true events too chilling to dismiss as mere coincidence or fantasy. Somewhere up there, an entity has learned all it needed about us, and we are left wondering what comes next, after the questions have been answered and the silence returns. And remember, the next time you stare up at the stars, that the cosmos might just be staring back, gathering its secrets, waiting for the moment to ask you the ultimate question. Story number 6. In the year 2006, the suburb of Pasadena was home to more than just the prestigious Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, of NASA. It was home to whispers of phenomena that defied explanation, a dark narrative that wove its way into the community's consciousness. This is my recounting of the events that transpired, ones I wish were nothing more than a figment of an overactive imagination. I was a systems analyst at JPL, surrounded by minds that reached for the stars but were firmly rooted in the empirical. That's why when my grandmother, once a communications specialist at the same facility, first told me about the silent walkers, I dismissed it as the product of an aging mind. She spoke of figures, draped in the void of space, that walked the sterile halls of the laboratory after hours. It happened to me, she insisted, her frail hands clutching mine, to see them, but no one else could. I should have listened. One night, after burning the midnight oil analyzing satellite data, I was walking the now empty halls when a chill crept up my spine. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, silhouettes, human-shaped voids in the air, gliding silently across the floor. They cast no shadows, made no sound, and vanished when I blinked. It happened to me, I would tell my friends, Damon and Claire, who had a shared interest in the paranormal. Damon, an engineer who dabbled in ghost hunting, and Claire, a psychologist fascinated by mass hysteria, were both skeptics. But the dread in my voice made them pause. The three of us decided to investigate after hours, equipped with Damon's array of sensors and Claire's voice recorder for any EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, sessions. We camped out in the main corridor where I saw the figures. It happened to me, Damon murmured hours into our stakeout, as his thermal camera picked up fleeting cold spots moving in unnatural patterns. There were no drafts, no vents nearby, but there they were, drops in temperature following an unseen path. And then we heard it, a faint whispering, like conversations being held just out of earshot. Claire's recorder captured it all, a cacophony of hushed tones that should not have been there. It happened to me, Claire whispered, her face pale as we played back the recording, hearing her name uttered among the static. Over the following weeks, we compiled evidence, presented it to the security at JPL, but the cameras showed nothing. The guards mocked us, saying we had let the stress get to our heads. That was until one of them, young and previously skeptical, came to us. "It happened to me," he said, shaken, admitting to seeing the walkers after reviewing tapes we insisted he watch. He saw them, or rather, he saw the lack of them, where our sensors indicated they should be. We delved into research, into realms of quantum physics and multidimensional theories, trying to understand. We uncovered old logs, reports from other employees over the years, tales of unexplained shadows and whispers, dating back to when my grandmother first worked there. It happened to me. Each story began, a thread connecting decades of encounters that culminated in a chilling realization. These walkers, whatever they were, had been here for a long time. We started believing they were not just lost travelers from another dimension, but perhaps something more sinister, surveying, collecting data, just like us. Then the deaths started. Unexplained, sudden, among those who had seen the silent walkers. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents where there should have been none. Damon vanished one night, and all they found of him was his equipment, scattered on the lab floor. "It happened to me" became the refrain of a song of madness and mystery. Claire left, fear driving her to distance herself from the investigation, from me, from JPL. And now, as I recount this tale, the air beside me feels cooler, the edges of my vision blur, and I hear the faintest whisper of my name. The silent walkers are here, a tale turned creepypasta to those who read it, but a living nightmare for me. This is my story, my evidence, my warning. If you find yourself walking alone in a place where science peels back the veil of the universe, pay attention to the shadows, the silence, and remember the silent walkers of JPL. Because it happened to me, and it could happen to you. Story number 7. In the autumn of 2007, the quaint, leaf-strewn streets of Huntsville, Alabama, with its deep-rooted ties to NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, became the backdrop for a series of events that were as chilling as they were inexplicable. I was a graduate student then, studying astrophysics, driven by dreams of stars and the silence of the void. But that silence was about to be filled with whispers of a tale that began decades ago, passed down to me by my grandmother, who had retired from a life's career at NASA. "It happened to me," she would begin, her voice a mixture of fear and wonder, recounting the story of the hibernation anomaly. Astronauts, sent on a classified mission beyond the moon, were placed in induced hibernation to conserve resources. When they were revived, their stories were disturbingly uniform, an unseen presence, watching them in their sleep, an entity that should not have been there. Intrigued and unnerved, I gathered a group of fellow students and local enthusiasts, young souls drawn to the dark allure of the unknown. Alex, a computer science prodigy, Rachel, a psychology major with a thesis on collective hallucinations, and Tyler, a would-be journalist with a nose for hidden truths. It happened to me, I found myself saying more than once, as we pored over leaked documents and whispered testimonies from contacts my grandmother still had within the space community. We met in hushed tones in an old cafe downtown, plotting our next moves. One night, driving back from one such clandestine meeting, a heavy fog descended on us, the kind that makes the familiar roads turn strange. "It happened to me," Rachel said quietly from the back seat, recounting a dream she had the night before, a dream where she walked the corridors of a spacecraft, feeling eyes upon her, a dream she hadn't told us until Alex, white as a sheet, admitted to the same nightmare. Our investigation led us to an abandoned building on the outskirts of Huntsville, once a secondary research facility. It was there that we found crates of old equipment and, more disturbingly, reels of audio recordings from the mission. Tyler managed to get an old tape player working, and we listened, hearts racing, to the astronauts describing their terror, the feeling of a presence, of eyes that watched. "It happened to me," one astronaut's voice trembled through the static, his fear transcending the years and gripping us all. We decided to hold a vigil, to play the recordings and see if we could invoke or understand the anomaly. As the astronauts' voices filled the derelict space, the temperature dropped, our breaths turned to mist, and a palpable sense of dread settled over us. "It happened to me," Alex whispered, staring at the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather and thicken. We all saw it then, a darkness that the dim light couldn't penetrate, a silence that seemed to echo with 1,000 unheard screams. The next weeks were a blur of terror. We were followed by shadows that lingered just on the periphery of our vision, haunted by dreams of being watched. Alex disappeared one evening. His car was found by the side of the road, door ajar, no sign of a struggle. It happened to me, became a curse that we carried, as one by one, we were picked apart by our own fears. Rachel withdrew from the world, her sanity frayed by the relentless feeling of being observed. Tyler's articles on the investigation were found torn to shreds in his apartment, the man himself gone without a trace. Now, I sit alone, writing this as a confession, a warning, a plea. If you find this, know that the presence from the hibernation anomaly is real, and it has reached from the stars to our very homes. The investigation has claimed my friends, my peace, and I fear, soon, my life. It happened to me, is the beginning and the end of my story. I can feel it watching, always, eternally present, just like the astronauts felt. I don't know if this presence is alien, demonic, or something else beyond our understanding. But if you're reading this, be careful of the silent spaces, of the moments when you think you're alone. Because you might not be. And once you feel its gaze upon you, there's no going back. It happened to me, and it could happen to you. Story number 8. I was driving through the rain-drenched streets of a forgotten suburb in Huntsville, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the torrential downpour. It was the fall of 2008, and I was on my way to meet with a group of friends who shared my fascination with the unexplained phenomena surrounding NASA's history, a passion inherited from my grandmother, a retired NASA employee with a lifetime's worth of stories. She had told me of the phantom cosmonaut, a tale so outlandish it was dismissed as a figment of conspiracy theorists' imaginations. Yet, it haunted her. An astronaut, she claimed, had been sent into the unknown expanse of space in the early days of space exploration, only to vanish without a trace. Sometimes, she would wake to the eerie crackle of her ham radio and a voice that seemed to reach across the cosmos, "I'm here, calling home." I was walking into the Satellite, a rundown cafe that became our unofficial headquarters, when I first shared the story with my friends. Jess, a sociology major with an interest in mass hysteria, Michael, an engineering student and a ham radio enthusiast, and Lauren, a freelance writer known for her spine-tingling blogs on paranormal activity. It happened to me, I confessed, as I recounted the nights I spent listening to the ham radio with my grandmother, the chilling voice that would occasionally break through the static. Driven by a mix of skepticism and curiosity, we embarked on an investigation, determined to uncover the truth. Michael rigged up an array of ham radios, spanning the frequencies my grandmother mentioned. Night after night, we listened, but the cosmos remained silent, until... It happened to me, Michael interrupted one evening, his voice a trembling whisper over the phone. He'd heard the voice, a ghostly plea echoing through the static. That was the beginning. We recorded the transmissions, analyzed them, and found patterns that led us to a derelict part of the local NASA facility that had been abandoned since the late 60s. It happened to me, Jess murmured one evening as we were walking through the old facility. She had felt a sudden chill, a sense of not being alone. Our flashlights flickered as we explored the decrepit corridors, the air thick with the dust of forgotten secrets. One by one, we experienced it, the sensation of being watched, the sudden temperature drops, the feeling of an unseen presence. Lauren wrote about our encounters, and the local community stirred with whispered rumors and fear. It happened to me, the phrase became our shared mantra, a testament to the chilling experiences that bound us together. Our research led us to the name of the lost cosmonaut, but as we delved deeper, things started to unravel. Jess claimed she saw a figure in an astronaut suit, drifting through the walls. Michael became withdrawn, spending hours on the radios, whispering back to the voice that only he could hear. It happened to me, Lauren's voice cracked as she recounted how her latest blog post was deleted mysteriously from her computer, replaced by a repeating message, "I'm still here, calling home." I remember the last night we were all together. We held a vigil in the facility, the radios crackling around us. A voice broke through, a voice full of loneliness and an unspeakable terror from the abyss. "It happened to me," it said. And then, just as quickly, the signal was lost, leaving a void that seemed to consume the very air we breathed. In the days that followed, Michael disappeared. His radios were found smashed to pieces. Jess was hospitalized, babbling about a walker in the void. Lauren never wrote again. Now, I sit alone, haunted by the memories, by the voice from the stars that connected us and tore us apart. Our investigation had uncovered something that perhaps should have remained hidden. It happened to me, I whisper to the night, to the rain that hasn't stopped since that last evening we were together. The voice from the stars is silent now, but I know it's still out there, lost, calling home. And part of me still listens, still hopes, and still fears. Story number 9. I was driving home from work through the empty lanes of a sleepy suburb on the outskirts of Houston when the first whisper of my grandmother's stories crept back into my mind. The night was unseasonably cool for Texas, and a dense fog was starting to curl around the streetlights like spectral fingers. My grandmother, a once prominent engineer at NASA during the Apollo missions, had often spoken of inexplicable events that had no place in science. Now 90, her stories were all I had left of her. She had once confided in me about a broadcast, a distress signal that came from the dark side of the moon, where silence should have reigned. An astronaut crying for help in English, a voice not recognized by anyone at Mission Control. It was 2009, and I couldn't shake the chill her story left in my bones. It happened to me one evening, not long after her passing. I was walking through my grandmother's study when I stumbled upon her old notes, a scrawled log of dates and times, frequencies, and a code name, Dark Side Broadcast. It was an obsession that had consumed her final years. I shared this discovery with my friends. Alex, a history teacher fascinated by Cold War space race myths, Elena, a linguist and codebreaker, and Tyler, a local journalist always looking for the story that could make his career. Alex was driving the effort, his excitement palpable. "This could be huge," he said. Elena pored over the notes, deciphering the patterns and anomalies in the transmissions my grandmother logged. Tyler was already crafting the narrative, his articles drawing the curious and the skeptical to our investigation. "It happened to me," Tyler whispered one night. He had received an anonymous email, a file with a sound clip, a voice, distant and full of static, but unmistakably pleading for rescue. Our curiosity turned into an obsession. We set up a makeshift listening station at my grandmother's old house, using her notes as a guide. We combed through radio static night after night, hoping to catch the broadcast ourselves. "It happened to me." Elena's voice trembled as she recounted how the words from the broadcast seemed to seep into her dreams, the voice begging not just for rescue but for release. We decided to hold a seance, half in jest, led by a medium who claimed to communicate with the spirits of lost souls. The air was electric with our collective anxiety as we sat in the dark, surrounding an old radio that served as our conduit to the beyond. "It happened to me," Alex said, eyes wide in terror. He had seen a figure in an old-style astronaut suit during the seance, just outside the window, looking in, its helmet reflecting no face, just the dark. The night after, our radio setup erupted with life. The distress signal came through clear, the voice filled with an urgency that made our hearts race. But it was what came after that froze our blood, a guttural language that no human throat could have formed, speaking in a cadence that felt ancient and wrong. The events that followed were a blur. Alex vanished without a trace, his car found abandoned by the side of the road. Elena withdrew from the world, murmuring of voices that whispered to her in languages long dead. Tyler's article stopped, the last one an incoherent warning about voices from the dark side of the moon. "It happened to me. I confess to anyone who will listen. I can still hear the voice sometimes, over the static of old radios, calling out from a place no human has tread. I live alone now, my nights spent scanning the skies and waiting for the signal to return. I tell my story, not sure if it serves as a caution or a desperate plea for understanding. In the suburbs of Houston, in a house filled with the relics of space history, I listen for the voice from the dark side of the moon, a voice that calls out from the cold emptiness, pleading for something I fear to comprehend. And I wonder if my grandmother, with all her knowledge and bravery, had felt the same bone-deep terror that now consumes me."